There's no impression quite like a first impression, at least that's how the saying goes, and where video games are concerned, that opening level in particular is hugely important. Now, while the following openings may not have vibed with all players, for anyone open-minded enough to have their expectations flipped in a major way, they undeniably raise some tantalizing questions. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video game opening levels that surprised us all. Number 10, Silent Hill. The original Silent Hill is one of the most singularly terrifying video games ever made, and it wastes absolutely no time at all sending players on a reality-bending descent into hells, both literal and symbolic. Now, while many survival horror games of the era gradually eased players into a terrifying situation, Silent Hill threw them headlong into a pulse-pounding nightmare. In fact, the game's very first level sees protagonist Harry Mason waking up from a car accident on the outskirts of the titular town, after which the player must run through the town's deserted, fog-soaked streets while pursuing Harry's missing daughter Cheryl. This eventually leads the player into a narrow alleyway where the camera angles become increasingly strange and disorientating, foreshadowing the horror that's just about to announce itself. Then the alley leads to a darker caged area where the player stumbles across a series of increasingly unsettling sights, including a corpse under a bloody sheet, while the intense musical score ramps up. This climaxes with Harry discovering some bloody humanoid remains stuck into a fence before similar looking creatures start attacking him and eventually kill him. Just when the player assumes they've reached a snappy game over screen though, the scene shifts to show Harry waking up in a nearby diner. It was all just part of the master plan. It is a masterful subversion of expectations that totally throws players off base, basically telling them to expect the unexpected for the remainder of the experience. Number 9, Prey 2017. Now, I love Prey, and despite Scott Tailford's claims to the contrary, stand by it as being one of the best games of the last gen. Knowing how to make a good first impression, the 2017 Prey reboot kicked off with a total jaw-dropper of an opening sequence, which the game's marketing had expertly concealed from unsuspecting players. See, protagonist Morgan Yu wakes up in their swanky apartment and gets ready to join a research team on the space station Talos 1, but not before undergoing a series of tests which essentially acts as the game's tutorial. Afterwards, the personnel on the other side of the glass are mauled by the alien creatures known as the Typhon, and Morgan passes out after being exposed to a sedative gas. They then wake up in their apartment, and though for a moment it might seem like the opening was all a dream, you're soon warned to leave the area, with the player smashing a nearby window to reveal that their apartment is actually just a simulation. In reality, Morgan isn't on Earth at all. They've already been living on Talos 1 for 3 years, and the Typhon outbreak has actually happened. Much like Silent Hill's opening, then, it tinkers with layers of reality to make the player anxious and paranoid, convincing them that nothing they see should be taken for granted. Number 8, Half-Life. Though Half-Life was hyped to the moon and back as the FPS game that you needed to play, few still could have seen its groundbreaking, unforgettable, and much imitated opening level coming. The game's first chapter, Black Mesa Inbound, sees players taking a scripted tram ride through the Black Mesa research facility. The 5-minute sequence confines the player to the tram carriage, but allows them to move around freely otherwise, taking in the facility's expansive labyrinth of labs and tunnels. There's arguably never been a better mood setter in video game history, and yet one which was so totally unexpected, by starting the game as protagonist Gordon Freeman as he begins his grueling first day at Black Mesa. There's also an added layer to the level, as those who pay real attention to their surroundings will notice much ominous shadowing for impending events, nuclear missiles in transit, toxic waste, and of course the presence of one G-Man himself. Even for those expecting Half-Life to be the second coming of Christ, this opening sequence was still like nothing else the FPS genre had ever delivered before. Number 7, Uncharted 2 Among Thieves. The original Uncharted was a solid, if not particularly inventive riff on the Indiana Jones-inspired action-adventure formula, so naturally most fans expected a modest incremental improvement at best for the sequel. But Uncharted 2 Among Thieves saw developers Naughty Dog eager to prove that this wasn't a garden variety sequel from its very first scene. As such, the game opens in the middle of the story, with a gravely wounded Nathan Drake trapped in a train hanging perilously over a snowy Tibetan cliff. At this point, players are handed the controls for a sweaty-palmed 5-minute escape sequence, which expertly melds player interaction with cinematic cutscenes to create an experience truly worthy of Indiana Jones. This level alone was a tectonic leap from the fairly generic shooter-puzzle platformer gameplay of its predecessor, and set the tone for a franchise that would continually push the boundaries of cinematic action. Number 6, Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy XV may be far from a perfect game, but it certainly opened in totally bewildering, uncharacteristic fashion for the standards of the franchise. For starters, the game begins in a medias res, with a brief snippet of Noctis and his pals battling Ifrit, which actually turns out to be one of the game's late-stage boss battles. The scene promptly shifts to the present, however, and the first time we're allowed to control Noctis, it's not to explore the world or fight some enemies, but to instead push a car with his friends, set to Florence and the Machine's cover of Stand By Me, no less. It's such a hilariously expectation-defying way to open a Final Fantasy game, especially considering just how long players had been waiting for the game to be released in the first place. All of that waiting, and your first proper task is to push your broken car down to Hammerhead gas station. On the flip side though, it near immediately endears players to the brotastic Central Quartet. Number 5. Battlefield 1. It's absolutely fair to say that the Battlefield campaigns have invited consistently low expectations over the years, due to their forgettable characters, generic storytelling, and by-the-numbers set pieces. But DICE made it clear that they wanted to upend that perception within the first few minutes of Battlefield 1's War Stories campaign mode. The story here begins with a prologue in which players control a member of the Harlem Hellfighters as they attempt to fend off a German onslaught in France. For a few moments, it might seem like a totally standard Battlefield set piece, until you are eventually killed by an enemy combatant, that is. Rather than reload the game from the previous checkpoint, your soldier's randomized name along with their year of birth and death will flash up on the screen, before you're then transported into the body of another nearby soldier to continue the fight. Each time you die, you'll be hurled into the body of another different type of soldier until making your way through the prologue and starting the game proper. It's easily the most creative part of the entire campaign, and immediately made players with low expectations sit up and pay attention. Owing to the more intimate character-driven stories of the rest of the campaign though, this soldier-hopping ability sadly couldn't carry on past the prologue. Number 4. Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 marked a major departure from the series' roots in many ways, namely ditching the outright survival horror vibe and fixed camera angles for an increased emphasis on action and an over-the-shoulder camera. The game's opening level was a stunning mission statement for Capcom's bold reinvention of the series as well, throwing protagonist Leon S. Kennedy into hellish rural Europe to rescue the US president's daughter. While both the second and third Resident Evil games wasted no time at all hurling undead enemies the player's way, the difficulty levels started out relatively simple and accessible, but not so much for Resident Evil 4. See, the opening level here gives players just a few moments to acclimate to the new controls and camera before sending in an entire village's worth of hostiles at them, including one maniac wielding a damn chainsaw. It is the perfect gaming embodiment of, well, that escalated quickly, and it does a fantastic, if stressful, job of briefing players on the game's general intensity level. Number 3. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild brought an unprecedented level of freedom to the franchise through its vast, teeming open world, and also by allowing players to make an immediate beeline to the very end of the story, should they so wish. After getting through the short prologue sequence, the game flashes up your ultimate objective: simply destroy Ganon. Hilariously, sufficiently determined players can head straight to Ganon and attempt to take him on if they want, though all but the most prepared are sure to suffer a swift death. Even so, it is a refreshing break from AAA linearity that players can attempt to wreck the big bad in record time and wrap the whole story up before it's even really begun. We're so used to developers guiding us along a semi-linear path, even in open world games, that for one to set your final task in stone right from the outset was a hugely pleasant surprise. Less surprising, of course, was the fact that the speedrunning community absolutely ended up having a ton of fun with it. Number 2. Fahrenheit. By first appearances, Quantic Dream's interactive drama Fahrenheit, aka Indigo Prophecy, was going to ease players into its supernatural murder mystery story. The opening scene takes place in a New York City diner on a snowy night, and despite the cozy appeal of the setting and the soothing Angelo Badalamenti score, which yes, I have been listening to all day since seeing this, all hell breaks loose inside of 3 minutes. In the diner bathroom, a poor guy is murdered by one of our protagonists, Lucas Kane, who has evidently been possessed as part of a malevolent ritual. Only then does the player gain control of Lucas, forced to clean up his bloody mess in the bathroom before hightailing it into the night. Most Quantic Dream games tend to ramp up the intensity a little more steadily, but Fahrenheit escalated from moody atmospherics to grisly murder within literal moments. As much as it briefed the player to anticipate some major tonal shifts throughout the story, ultimately the game's rushed development resulted in a head-scratching laughingstock of a third act. Still, what an opening. Number 1. Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Castlevania Symphony of the Night is a direct sequel to Castlevania Rondo of Blood, and despite releasing just 4 years later, made the unexpected decision to recreate Rondo of Blood's final boss fight in its opening sequence. Consequently, players are thrust back into the shoes of Richter Belmont to once again battle Count Dracula in an altered version of the prior boss battle. You can't die during the fight, so it serves more as a skill check to bring players back up to speed. Curiously as well, how well you play during this fight and how quickly you defeat Dracula also determines the equipment and stat boosts afforded to Symphony of the Night's actual protagonist you start controlling afterwards, that being the iconic Alucard. It's an extremely novel and unexpected way to remind players of the previous game's story while also reacclimating them to the gameplay, and it's honestly surprising we haven't seen this technique adopted more over the years. So that's our list. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. What do you think of these video game openings, and are there any surprising ones I missed off here? While you're down there as well, could you please give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't though, I've been Josh, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.